We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Beis and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 52b. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, does Rabbi Yishmael really hold that the mitzvah by the chatas ha'of, that's the squeezing out of the remaining blood by the chatas ha'of, does he really hold that is ma'akev, that is required? We find that the Talmud of Rabbi Yishmael says, V'she'eino nishur, if there's nothing remaining, lo yimatze, that it doesn't need to be squeezed out. Rashi explains, V'she'eino nishur, kolomar im yotza kol hadam. What it means is if all the blood already went out when the blood was applied, it was sprinkled from the bird, so behazah, that's in the sprinkling, so then ein sarach mitzvah, so then the squeezing out is not necessary. It seems like it's not ma'akev. And the Gemara continues and answers, Trei tanoi v'alibid Rabbi Yishmael. It's machlokas tanoim, what exactly Rabbi Yishmael held in this regard. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rami Bar Chama says, Hai Tana Savar, the following Tana holds that Shirayim Ma'akvi, that the Shirayim, again, the pouring of the remnant blood to the base of the outer Mizbeach as Ma'akev is required. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, HaKohen HaMechate Osa, it says the Kohen who sprinkles it. This is talking about sprinkling the blood from the Karban Chatos. And it says, Osa Shaniton Domo Lamal, it means those kinds of Karban Chatos where the blood is supposed to be applied to the upper half of the Mizbeach. Velo Osa Shaniton Domo Lamata, you're not supposed to apply the blood to the lower half of the Mizbeach. That's talking about a Karban Chatos, an outer Karban Chatos of an animal. It's supposed to be applied to the upper part of the Mizbeach, not the lower part. And the Braisa is saying we derive from the pasuk that if it's applied in the wrong place, if it's applied to the lower part, it's going to be disqualified. And the Braisa continues, Amrit, we say, V'chime'ayin basa, but what are we coming from? Why would we think in the first place that it would be kosher? That's the question of the Braisa. Why do we need a pasuk to say pasel? Why would we think it would be kosher if it would be applied in the wrong part of the Mizbeach? And the Braisa explains, Michlal shenemar v'dam zvachecha yishafech al mizbach. It talks about pouring the blood, and we learn from that pasuk, and this was mentioned earlier, Lamadnu l'nitanin b'matan arba. It teaches us that, let's say you have a carbon where you're supposed to apply to do 4 applications of the blood, Shem Nisanan b'matana achas keeper, that even if you did 1 application, that's still going to be sufficient. It's still going to be a kapara, it's still going to be atonement. That's a halacha we learned earlier. And because we know of that halacha, so one might think, Af hanitanin lamala, also blood that's supposed to be applied to the upper part of the Mizbeach, Shem Nisanan lamata, which was instead applied to the lower part of the Mizbeach keeper, one would think that would be an atonement also. That's why we need a pasuk to say that it is no good. And the Braisa continues, Vidinhu, now it's logical as follows. Nemru domim lamala. It says domim lamala. Again, it says domim that's supposed to be applied to the upper part of the Mizbeach. V'nemru domim lamatan. It also says domim lamatan. There's also blood that's sometimes applied to the lower part of the Mizbeach. That's by a chatas ha'of. By the chatas of an animal, it's applied to the upper part of the Mizbeach. By a chatas of an oaf of a bird, it's applied to the lower part of the Mizbeach. Ma domim hu'amurim lamatan shenesanan lamalan lo keeper. So the Braisa now argues, we know that the blood that's supposed to be applied to the lower part of the Mizbeach, if it's applied to the upper part of the Mizbeach, it is not a kapara, it's not an atonement. So af domim ho'amurim lamalan, so we should say the same, the opposite. The blood that's supposed to be applied to the upper part of the Mizbeach, im nasan lamata lo keeper. If he applies it to the lower part of the Mizbeach, it's not a kapara, meaning the Braisa is arguing, now we don't need a pasuk for this, it's logical. Obviously it's not going to be a kapara because we make an argument from the bird Karban Chatos, where you certainly cannot apply the blood to the upper part of the Mizbeach. We can make an argument that you certainly can't do the same when it comes to an animal Karban Chatos, so what do we need a pasuk for? But the Braisa continues and says that we can counter that argument because lo imamri betachtonim, when it comes to the blood that's supposed to be applied to the lower part of the Mizbeach, shenitanin b'nesina l'mal, if you're going to apply that to the upper part of the Mizbeach, she'ein sofan l'mal, but there, ein sofan l'mal, and there is no application there of the blood to the upper part of the Mizbeach at all. That kind of blood never reaches the upper part of the Mizbeach. So lo keeper, so it's logical to say it's not an atonement. Tomar, whereas we'll say bo'elyonim, when we're talking about the blood that's supposed to be applied to the upper part of the Mizbeach, shenesanan lamata, there if you're applying it to the lower part of the Mizbeach, sheyesh mehen karav lamata, there is an application of the blood below, meaning there is a concept of pouring the remnant of the blood to the base of the Mizbeach, and so therefore it's different when we're talking about blood that's supposed to be applied to the upper half of the Mizbeach, it's applied to the lower half. We already have a precedent that there is going to be some of the blood applied, so to speak, meaning when you pour the remnant to the lower half, so maybe it would be good, and so therefore again, that goes back to why the Braisa says we do in fact need a pasuk to say that it's no good. But the Braisa continues and argues, damim hapnimiyim yochichu, but we can bring a proof from the blood of the inner Karban Chatos, sheyesh mehen karev b'chutz, because there is some application of the blood to the outer Mizbeach. They pour the remnant of the blood to the base of the outer Mizbeach. But yet, but yet if you were to apply from the outset, if the applications of the blood would be to the outer Mizbeach, lo keeper, it would not be an atonement. So you can't make that argument that since you have some application there of the remnant, therefore maybe it would be kosher, because we see that's not true when it comes to the chatos, when it comes to the inner carbon chatos. But the Brisa counters, lo emamrid bedam hapnimiyim. But what's different about the dam hapnimiyim, of the blood of the inner carbon chatos, she'ein mizbeach hapnimi memarkon. This is going to be explained by the Gemara, but the mizbeach hapnimi, the inner mizbeach, is not the finishing, it's not the conclusion of the avoda. Tomar be'elyonim, whereas when it comes to the elyonim, the applications, again, to the outer mizbeach, the upper part of the mizbeach, sharei karnos memarkos, so son, there already, that is the completion. There, when you apply that blood to the upper part of the mizbeach, that's the completion of the avoda. So im nesan on lamatok sherim. So then one might think, again, it's different, and if it would be applied below, it would be kosher. In fact, that's the logic why one would think it's kosher. Talmud lomar osa, again, back to the pasuk that the Brisa brought. The pasuk says osa sheniten damim lamala, velo sheniten dama lamata. Again, it has to be that it's applied above, not applied below. If it's applied below, it is not going to be good. And the entire point of bringing this Brisa is, again, to prove that the shirayim are ma'akev, and that's what the Gemara now does. Mai she'ein mizbeach hapnimi memarkon. In the course of this whole of these arguments and counter arguments, it said that the mizbeach hapnimi, it's not finished. It doesn't. It's the avoda is not finished in the mizbeach hapnimi. It's not finished in the inner mizbeach. What does that mean? Lav elu shirayim. Isn't this a reference to shirayim? And what the Brisa is saying at the end is it's contrasting the inner carbon chatos with the outer carbon chatos. It's saying by the inner carbon chatos, it's not finished. The application of the blood inside the Beis Hamikdash doesn't finish the avoda because the shirayim are required. And so you see there is a carbon chatos where the shirayim are required, and that's not true by the outer carbon chatos. That seems to have been the point of the Brisa, and so you see that's what Rami Bar Chama is bringing from this Brisa. You see that that at least with regards to the inner carbon chatos, the shirayim are ma'akev. But the Gemara continues and says, Amar le Rava said to him, if that's true, if so, if that's what the Brisa means, that again, by the inner carbon chatos, the shirayim are ma'akev, so then still, Teisi b'kal v'chomer, still we can use the kal v'chomer as follows. Ma shirayim hapnimiyim, when it comes to the remnant blood of the inner carbon chatos, shesofan chova b'chutz, where at the end there is an obligation in terms of pouring it to the base of the outer mizbeach, ason b'tchila b'chutz lo keeper, but if you do the initial applications by the outer mizbeach, it's no good. So now we can make the argument, Hanitanin Lamala, by those karbanos where the application of the blood is supposed to be the upper half of the Mizbeach. Shein Sofan Chova Lamata, where there is no obligation Lamata, because again the Shirayim is not Ma'akev by the outer carbon chatos. Vason Betchila Lamata, and then he's going to initially do the applications on the lower half of the Mizbeach. Einodin Shalo Keeper. Isn't it logical to say that it should not be a kapara? And that would take us right back to the original question, why do we need a pasuk to say Lo Keeper? We would have an argument to say Lo Keeper, a logical argument. And so the Gemara just says, we reinterpret that line, Ela'ein mizbeach hapnimi memarkon bilvad. What the Brisa simply meant was, the mizbeach hapnimi, the inner mizbeach, isn't the conclusion of the applications of the blood, because there's still other inner applications of the blood, ela paroches, because there is an application of the blood to the paroches, to the curtain, in which case this Brisa has nothing to do with whether the shirayim are ma'akev. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, V'chila mikaper, it says in the pasuk that he finishes from doing the atonement. This is talking about finishing the avodos, the applications of the blood, on Yom Kippur. And we darsh in the pasuk as follows, Im kiper kila, if the atonements are done, then it's finished. V'im lo kiper, if he doesn't do the atonements, lo kila, then it's not finished. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda said to him, Mipnei malo nemar, im kilo kiper, im lo kilo lo kiper. Why doesn't it say that if he finished, it's an atonement? If he didn't finish, it's not an atonement. It means shem chisar achas mikol hamatanos, that if he's missing any of the applications of the blood, lo asav lo klum, then it's as if he has done nothing. And the Gemara continues and explains the Brisa, Mai beinayu, what's the difference between the two opinions, between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. This is a machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Chad Amar Mashmos Dor Shenika beinayu. One says that the difference is just how you understand the psukim. V'chad Amar Shirayim Ma'akven Ika beinayu. And the other opinion is no, there's actually a disagreement in terms of whether the Shirayim, whether the pouring of the remnant of the blood at the base of the outer Mizbeach, whether or not that is Ma'akev, whether or not that is required. And Rashi explains, Mashmos darshan, the understanding of the psukim, that's the difference between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda. Tarvayu l'lamed al hamatanos shema'akvos ka'amri. Both of them are understanding the psukim that they're teaching, that the matanos, the applications of the blood on Yom Kippur, those are required. Elamar mashmalei hachi, omar mashmalei hachi. Just one understands the psukim in this fashion, and one in the other fashion. And Rashi elaborates, Rabbi Akiva mashmalei midaseifa l'reisha midrash. Rabbi Akiva, he darshans the pasuk from the end to the beginning. B'chapara dahainu b'matanos tluya hashlama. It's the applications of the blood. That's the kapara. B'matanos, the applications of the blood. That's what the hashlama, the completion of the avodah, is dependent upon. V'shirayim lo ma'akve. And Rabbi Akiva simply saying that the pouring of the remnant blood to the base of the mizbeach is not required. For Rabbi Yehuda nami shirayim lo ma'akve islay. And Rabbi Yehuda agrees that the shirayim is not ma'akev. And he's simply saying as follows: My time matidr shehachi. Why are you darshaning the pasuk in this fashion? The hashta lo shaminon mina shekol matanos of ma'akvos. Because when you darshan it in the way that you're darshaning it, you're not able to derive that all the applications are required. Because you could say that the pasuk just means one application is needed. Dumya de chatos hachitzonos. Just like we find by the outer carbon chatos, that all that's required is one application. And so therefore, therefore Rabbi Yehuda says, you should darshan in the following fashion. Im kilo hakol kemasha kosavu dechiper. If you finish everything like it's written, then you have a kapara. You got to do all the applications. Vim lo kilo kol masha be'inyan lo keeper. If you don't finish everything, it's not a kapara. V'lamanu shem chisar achas min amatonos lo asa klum. And that way we're able to learn that if you leave out even one application, it's nothing. V'shirayim lo ma'akvi. And also again, the remnant blood is not required. She'enon amurin be'inyan zeh. They're not mentioned over here in this topic. Tegabe parkoin mashiach udis ravi par yom hakipurim l'shirayim, because it's by the part of the Kohen Gadol that we include that there's a halach of shirayim by par yom hakipurim. Well, Rabbi Yehuda tzarich lemelef ikov matanos mehacha. Now Rabbi Yehuda needs to learn that all the applications are required from here. Mishum damar ki ksiva chuka b'dvarim hanasim bebigdei lavan lefnai v'lefnim hu dechsev, because he holds that chuka is written by things that are done in the white garments lefnai v'lefnim. And so therefore, again, that's why there's really no actual difference between them practically. It's just mashmos darshan ika beinayu. But then one opinion says no, shirayim ma'akev, and the difference between them is whether the remnant blood is ma'akev. Shirayim ma'akev ika beinayu, says Rashi. Ulu Rabbi Akiva lo ma'akev. According to this approach, according to Rabbi Akiva, the shirayim are not ma'akev. V'hachi kamar, and it's saying as follows: Im kiper masha amr b'inyan kila dechsev chuka likuva. Again, if he does the atonement that's written over here, where it says chuka, that's required. Aval shirayim she'eno amr b'inyan lo ma'akev. But the shirayim that are not stated over here in this topic is not required. V'yaz Rabbi Yehuda lemeimar kila kol tzorchei avodosav. And then according to this approach, Rabbi Yehuda is saying everything needs to be done. V'yaf ha'melamdin lo mimakam acher. And even what we learn from the other source, keeper, then it's a kapara. V'im lo kila lo keeper. If he doesn't finish, it's not a kapara. Shem chisar achas mikol hamatonos. V'afilu b'matan yisod mashma. There, even missing one thing, even the pouring of the blood to the yisod of the mizbeach, even that is going to be ma'akev. And the Gemara continues, Testayim Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi hu da'amar shirayim de ma'akve. Let us conclude that it's Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and not Rabbi Yochanan. It's Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi who's the one that says that there is a machlokas here between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda, whether the shirayim are ma'akev, and that again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the shirayim are ma'akev. Let us suggest that it's Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi who says that. Da'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, because Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, L'divrei ha'omer shirayim ma'akvin, according to the one who says that on Yom Kippur, the pouring of the remnant blood to the base of the outer mizbech is ma'akev, is required. So then let's say the blood spills after all the applications are done. The general halacha is you're supposed to bring another animal and start from the last set. So in this situation, all that's left is the shirayim. So maybe parechru maschil betchila bifnim. You can't just bring a par just to do the shirayim, which are required. So you start one stage earlier, you bring that bull, again you start with the applications inside, and then you do the shirayim, because shirayim have to be a leftover. It has to be a leftover from some application. You can't just bring an animal just to do the shirayim. But the point over here is that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, according to the one who says shirayim are ma'akev, that implies someone says that. Who's the person who says that? It makes sense to say it's Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is the one that would say Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda argue about this issue. But the Gemara continues and says, Atu Rabbi Yochanan leslei hasvara. But do you think Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of this svara, of this logic? V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Yochanan said, Tanu Rabbi Nechemya kedivrei ha'omer shirayim ma'akvin, that Rabbi Nechemya learns like the one who says says Shirayim Ma'akvin, he also says there's somebody who says Shirayim Ma'akvin. Ela Kedivrei Homer, rather, what is Kedivrei Homer like the one who says? V'lav Lahani Tanoi, it's not necessarily a reference to these particular Tanoim, meaning this Machlokes, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda. It's just some Tana, there's a Tana who says Shirayim Ma'akvin. So we don't know that it's relevant to this Brisa. Hachanami here also within Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Kedivrei Homer is saying according to the one who says V'lav Lahani Tanoi. It's not necessarily a reference to these Tanoim. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah Chatos Hatzibur when it comes to the communal Karban Chatos, V'hayochid, and also the individual ones. Eluhain Chatos Hatzibur. The following are Chatos Hatzibur, are communal Karban Chatos. Seirei Rosh Chodashim, the goats that are brought on Rosh Chodesh, V'shel Moadus, and on the holidays. What's the halachas by those? Shchitasan B'tzafon, V'kibul Daman B'chlisharis B'tzafon. They are slaughtered in the north of the Azara, and their blood is received with the Klisharis in the north of the Azara. V'daman ton arba matanos al arba karnos, and their blood needs to be applied 4 applications on the 4 corners. Keitzad, how so? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph.